Happy Monday, everyone. Hello, friends. Happy Monday, and esteemed jurors with oodles of experience. I wanted to start this presentation with a quick show of hands. So, who in here has visited or maybe just even walked through a park this past week? Doesn't matter if it's for a short time, that's amazing. You all are taking advantage of the city's wonderful parks. I'm so glad. But let's think about why we went there. Did you spend time with friends or family, perhaps? Maybe you played a sport or a game. Maybe you did some exercise, and if that's the case, congrats. Maybe you admired the trees, the flowers, the natural landscape of the park. Whatever the reason was, it shows us that green spaces are really more than what meets the eye. And I wanted us to think about this again, but in the context of 2.5 years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic. Green spaces were really an important part of many of our lives, especially for those who are living in cities. Not only that, in the past year, summers have gotten hotter, wildfires are burning more than ever, and floods are also one of the most costliest natural disasters in Canada. Increasing severe weather events are a direct result of climate change. So these impacts of climate change are being felt all across different communities in Canada, including in urban areas where 3 out of 4 Canadians live. Much needs to be done to reduce these climate risks, to prevent further losses to life and livelihoods, to increase access to nature and green spaces, and shift the way we relate to nature. So last year, our team was posed with this question: how should Intact Financial Corporation actively engage the federal government in accelerating the conservation, protection, and restoration of natural infrastructure in Canada? So we might ask ourselves, what is natural infrastructure? So before we even get to the policy recommendations themselves, let's talk a little bit about natural infrastructure. The two words might sound a bit like an oxymoron, and that's exactly what it is. So we'll start with the word infrastructure first. So we typically think of infrastructure as built structures that deliver particular services. And they also tend to last quite a long time, think like 10 years, for example, when you think of like roads and bridges, telecommunication systems, railway, metro, these last decades and decades, if not more. They're also called conventional or gray infrastructure. So what is natural infrastructure then? So when it comes to natural infrastructure, it's about restoring, conserving, managing, and building natural ecosystem features and materials in order to deliver those particular services. In the world of climate mitigation and adaptation, natural infrastructure's main service is to reduce or mitigate those climate risks while delivering on other benefits to both environmental and human well-being. So examples of natural infrastructures would include, for example, naturally occurring ponds in a coastal town, restored and managed wetlands, coral reefs, urban forests, and meadows, for example. Whereas gray infrastructure or conventional adaptation infrastructure would be things like dams, seawalls, dikes, and drainage pipes. So why are we interested in natural infrastructure, you might ask? Is because it's cost saving over time, whereas dams and stuff will break down over time and you need to fix those things. When we restore a wetland, those things will save costs over time because they mature, and in fact, they deliver more benefits over time, and you don't need to fix them up really. It's a low carbon solution, less concrete. They have multiple co-benefits. It's a multi-solving tool and can be integrated in a number of settings, including urban. So here's our proposal. We recommend Parks Plus, and the slides are not changing. Here we go. Parks Plus. So Parks Plus is an ambitious program which establishes at least one urban park in every province and territory. It requires working collaboratively across different partners, from the insurance sectors to civil society, indigenous governments, post-secondary institutions. And what makes this different from like a plain old park is that it's designed primarily to reduce specific local climate risks while achieving other co-benefits. As well, the process itself will be part of like a community of practice. It's a cohort program like ours, which would be conducive for knowledge sharing and building capacity across the country. So in this sense, Parks Plus will answer the challenge question in two ways. One, it will scale up natural infrastructure solutions because it provides an avenue for multiple sites of this to happen all at once, or at least in a similar time scale. It provides opportunity for collaboration and builds capacity for future action. Secondly, Parks Plus will accelerate natural infrastructure solutions because we will draw from private sector expertise. It also hopes to create new institutional arrangements so that it will fast-track the establishment of natural infrastructure in the future. Parks Plus is also a clear signal to the private sector and Canadians at large about the federal government's priorities in reducing climate risks, which in turn we hope will attract more partnerships, investment, expertise, and political support, given that this is quite an emerging field. But more importantly, Parks Plus is designed to be quite visible to the public. Given that it will be located in an urban area, there's an opportunity to integrate educational programming, it is an opportunity for placemaking, for learning, connecting with nature, and even just for urban residents to seek refuge on a hot summer day. We also propose two foundational guiding principles to underscore the work of Parks Plus. And first, Parks Plus will be considered on a watershed scale. So that's the first point. This is also referred to as integrated watershed management. And what this is about looking at the creation of these urban parks, not in a vacuum, but not in ways that are confined by municipal borders or administrative boundaries, but rather in a more holistic scale that considers impact upstream and downstream and around. Secondly, given that this policy is ultimately about land use, we propose partnerships with Indigenous governments and communities should be centered throughout all phases. Do you recognize these parks? I hope you at least recognize one of them. These are well-known, well-loved parks. These are parks that make Montreal, Montreal, New York, New York. And Parks Plus will naturally look different, given its primary function is to reduce specific local climate risk. In the same way, parks will look different in different cities. And because it's for reducing local climate risks, not just recreation or aesthetics, the hope and ambition is that Parks Plus will become integrated into the urban landscape, just like these parks are. They'll become the heart of these communities. It can be a hub for community resilience. So now that we've covered the basics, my teammates will be expanding more on the recommendations. Next, my teammate Linda will be doing a deep dive into our policy recommendations in more detail and why it's worth doing, the benefits and the opportunities. Ankita will be going over the roles and the partners and what they can contribute to this policy. Ankita will also touch upon some co-governance case studies that we're pulling from. Jamajay will then explain to you why this is a feasible policy, and he'll explain our costing approach, provide a very brief analysis, and then conclude our parks pitch. And then we'll open it to Q&A. And with that, I'll pass it on to my teammates. Oops, sorry.
Thank you, Prad. As Prad alluded to earlier, we're advocating to Intact Foundation to pick up our Parks Plus proposal and put it into action. As alluded to earlier as well, Parks Plus consists of 5 pillars to be able to accelerate and scale up natural infrastructure in every province and territory. Firstly, for institutional arrangements, so I'll go through the primary recommendations for each of these pillars, and the rest can be found in our brief. So firstly, Parks Plus institutional arrangements. For this pillar, this primarily consists of the administrative and foundational components for the program. We recommend that the federal government establish a steering committee with representation from federal departments such as Infrastructure Canada, NRCan, ECCC, and Parks Canada. We recommend that the steering committee commit to commissioning a study to look into the implementation for Parks Plus. Since Infrastructure Canada is a leader already in administering the Natural Infrastructure Fund, we also believe that they should play a leading role for this program. To ensure that there's a diversity of voices around the table, this steering committee should also consult with Indigenous partners, provincial, territorial, municipal governments as well. Secondly, Parks Plus co-governance. This involves the specific co-governance for each of the 13 park sites that we envision. We recommend that a board structure be set up with representatives from every level of government, Indigenous partners, the insurance sector, and civil society here. Because each park site will be located on an area that spans multiple jurisdictions, centering local decision-making will be central here. We also recommend that every board consider its relationship to treaty bodies and Indigenous communities. Co-governance here can also ensure that there's consent provided by all the partners involved before any other stage is scaled up. Thirdly, Parks Plus criteria. This pillar involves the specific criteria for each of the park sites. Although it will be ultimately up to the each board for each of the sites to decide upon where the parks will be located, we do recommend some standards be put in place so that the objectives of Parks Plus can be realized. For instance, we're recommending that each park must be 1, located in an urban setting, 2, ensure that there's a public engagement component, 3, ensure that its main feature actually reduces climate risks, 4, ensure that the size of the park demonstrates positive impacts at a neighborhood or watershed scale, and 5, ensure partnerships with public post-secondary institutions and Indigenous communities. We also recommend prioritizing proposals for parks that demonstrate a strong case for accelerating nature-based solutions. So some of these might look like proposals that seek to expand wetland areas, that they might be reforesting native species or replantings, and also along critical freshwater resources and aim to protect them. Fourthly, for capacity building, this pillar is more about the longer-term sustainability for the program. We recommend that the federal government work in partnership with public post-secondary institutions to build specialized training and dedicate research funding to be able to build up knowledge and skills in the sector. Finally, for monitoring and evaluation, this pillar, we recommend that the federal government establish a centralized data hub so that information that's collected about each of these parks can be shared amongst each of the boards as well as partners involved. The federal government can also partner with boards to establish evaluation performance indicators that can be assessed over time. And finally, in this area, we recommend setting up an independent auditor to be able to evaluate program outcomes and financial assessments. At the core of projects like Parks Plus, there's the potential to enjoy many co-benefits of natural infrastructure. A recent Canadian Climate Institute report finds that for every dollar that's invested in natural adaptation, including natural infrastructure, there's an estimated $13 to $15 in accrued benefits. This includes $5 to $6 in benefits through avoided damages in repairs and replacement costs of infrastructure. As well, there's an estimated $6 to $10 that's circulated in the economy. These savings can be put back into communities and be focused in other parts of the economy. There are also indirect or intangible benefits to natural infrastructure that can be yielded in the longer term. Programs like Parks Plus are not only a form of natural infrastructure, but also a form of social infrastructure, which are spaces that can help foster community connections. Access to nature and green spaces has been found to be positively linked to more positive health outcomes, which ultimately can also reduce the costs on our healthcare systems, which is much needed now. This is particularly important for urban settings, which have been found to be contributors to accelerated climate impacts. Investing in natural infrastructure can also support capacity building and professional development because there's a greater demand for these skills and knowledge. Finally, this also enhances political support for future natural infrastructure projects, given that there's a greater recognition of these co-benefits. To put things into perspective of what this could look like for Parks Plus, we wanted to draw on and illustrate through a case study from Vancouver. Through co-governance and management between the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority and the Vancouver Parks and Recreation Center, In collaboration with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, they worked to restore a parkland area in 2017 and to scale up natural infrastructure. After just a short 4 to 5 years, the project successfully restored fish and wildlife habitats. In fact, tidal influence in the area returned for the first time since the 1960s, which has since helped the salmon population flourish. Beyond the ecological benefits, there are also social and economic ones too. Because the site is now more resilient, it can better mitigate flood risks, and the public can enjoy more of this green space. This case study demonstrates that just in a relatively short time, so 4 to 5 years, as you can see from left to right images, that the benefits and the co-benefits of natural infrastructure can be enjoyed. So imagine what this could look like on a larger scale across the country. And I'll pass it on to my colleague Ankita.
Thank you, Linda and Prod. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the key partners for Parks Plus because that's an important component of our proposal overall. So as you can see, first we have the federal government, and we highly recommend that the federal government take the lead in both funding and technical expertise. How we envision that is through Infrastructure Canada leading the entire initiative, along with Parks Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Natural Resources Canada. Now, spread across these federal agencies that I've just mentioned are several funding mechanisms that could be hugely beneficial for Parks Plus, including the Climate Action Fund, the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and the Natural Infrastructure Fund. Additionally, we envision the federal government providing engineering, institutional, planning, and management support for all the other key partners that are involved in Parks Plus, as is illustrated on this slide. Essentially, what we envision in terms of the federal government leading the initiative is to align all current climate action efforts spread across the country through Parks Plus. Now, we also highly recommend that the insurance sector be mobilized for ensuring the success of Parks Plus. Now, that's because we have explored and realized the kind of vested interests or the kind of deep interests and role that the insurance sector already plays in terms of climate adaptation and resilience. Essentially, the insurance sector is already playing a key role in financial recovery after losses that are caused due to extreme weather events. Now, you might ultimately think of the possibility of the private sector entering into potentially an issue that is supposed to be covered by the public sector. Now, I want to point out at this point that the public-private partnership model is not necessarily a bad one, and in this case we're not proposing essentially a public-private partnership either. What we're proposing is that all key stakeholders be brought together through this initiative and all of their contributions be acknowledged and regulated, especially in the case of the insurance sector through the Insurance Bureau of Canada. So essentially, this is the role that we envision for Intact Foundation, especially in terms of the Insurance Bureau of Canada coordinating the technical data, asset evaluation, risk assessment, and research partnerships that the insurance sector overall can provide for Parks Plus. Now, when we come to the provincial and municipal governments, we see that at this point of time, the municipal governments actually do not have enough of information related to the value and the services that natural resources actually provide in terms of service delivery, especially at the local level. And that relates back to the provincial government because naturally the municipal governments are directly under the jurisdiction of each province. With that in mind, we propose that the municipalities also play an extremely significant role in Parks Plus. And Parks Plus essentially must mobilize municipalities because asset management, even while it's trending upwards in Canada, has not been realized fully at the local level. The variety of benefits provided by nature, like stormwater management, recreation, and culture, requires each local government department to coordinate closely with each other in protecting and managing nature. And Intact already has several interesting projects on natural infrastructure in place with municipalities across Canada. And these should be leveraged and scaled up to become part of Parks Plus. And because of the differences in autonomy and resources that exist between local governments and the province, the provincial governments must play a key role in data collection, monitoring and evaluation, accounting of natural assets at the local level and at the provincial level, as well as jurisdictional coordination. I would also like to draw attention to the role that Parks Plus can potentially play in becoming a national effort, a concrete national effort for embedding principles of truth and reconciliation, especially so that Indigenous communities can fully exercise their rights. Their rights are currently enshrined in the Canada UNDRIP Act, and Parks Plus will potentially provide a huge opportunity of increasing Indigenous knowledge systems, examining the nuances of Indigenous guardianship programs, and generally concretely create long-term opportunities for Indigenous communities to participate and become a core part of Canada's natural infrastructure assets. And finally, we envision the role of civil society and academic institutions also, who must provide a certain level of technical expertise for the success of Parks Plus. Essentially, we are looking at the role that Intact Center already plays in collaboration with the University of Waterloo in conducting unique original research on assessing climate risks. We also envision Parks Plus to be the potential for nationally coordinated research, especially through the role that post-secondary institutions can play in relation to each park site for coordinating national research into climate risks. And we also want to draw attention to Intact Foundation's current project with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, a leading civil society organization on climate and nature, on wetland carbon sinks. Now, as we discuss the approach of co-governance, which is a huge part of the key partners' roles in Parks Plus, I want to especially draw attention to the role that the co-governance model plays, especially through the example of case studies. Because whenever one thinks about bringing forward the participation of Indigenous communities, especially in relation to natural infrastructure projects, while Canada, especially at the federal level, has the objective and the excellent intention of fulfilling goals of truth and reconciliation, there has always been a certain amount of skepticism in relation to the significant complexity that exists, that naturally exists, in bringing forward Indigenous communities and nations in relation to national infrastructure projects. Now, we want to draw attention through these case studies that a co-governance model, a co-governance approach in many forms exists in Canada already, and therefore it's not impossible to achieve, and Parks Plus must make this the norm rather than the exception. With that in mind, one example that I want to draw attention to is the Mackenzie River Basin Agreement, which essentially, the agreement essentially binds 6 governments in Canada to work together to protect the water resources of the entire river basin. And the guiding principles of this agreement lie in equitable utilization, consultations, sustainability, and ecological integrity. Another excellent example that we feel models the kind of approach that Parks Plus must take is our conservation authorities in the Ontario province. Conservation authorities generally have projects that are similar to the Trebna Tract Wetland and Meadow Restoration Project, which essentially restores forests, wetlands, and grasslands in an area that is currently under corn, beans, and wheat rotation. And it's expected that this project, that this restoration project will essentially support migratory birds and waterfowl, enhance floodwater retention capacity, and improve air quality, all while bringing forward the principle and the approach of co-management. Finally, we also have an interesting case study in the form of the Meewasin Valley National Urban Park, which is located in the province of Saskatoon. It provides right now a space for indigenous stewardship, promoting indigenous wisdom, and generally offers opportunity for creating a deeper connection to natural resources that doesn't necessarily exist with the wider Canadian society, essentially based on indigenous knowledge systems. So, this is essentially what we want to communicate in relation to this very important component of Parks Plus. And now I will hand over the floor to my colleague, Janmati.
Thank you, Ankita. Now, in order to pitch the project of Parks Plus to potential policymakers and stakeholders, we need to have a costing methodology, obviously. And in order to do that, in order to calculate a ballpark costing figure for Parks Plus, we utilize two commonly used methods for costing based on existing case studies. We use the analogous method to basically identify similar case studies that we could use to identify the costing for individual parks under Parks Plus, and then we aggregated this information to estimate the total costs. Now we understand that the planning, implementation, and monitoring costs of each of these Parks Plus sites has been included as as part of these case studies, but certain costs, such as for capacity building, for setting up institutional arrangements, for engaging with the public, these might not have been covered as part of these estimates, but can be determined at a later phase of work. Now, in terms of natural infrastructure project can tend to be either leaning towards either highly extensive restoration project or towards relatively less intensive conservation and protection projects, or even typically a combination of all of them, depending on the condition of the natural system in question. Based on this, we assumed and calculated the cost of this entire project based on a few assumptions that we took. We considered Parks Plus as a demonstrative project and thought that at least one project should be selected from each of the 10 provinces and 3 territories. And if we select parks the size of 200 hectares, similar to the size of Mont-Royal in Montreal or High Park in Toronto, and 10 smaller parks, the size of La Fontaine, which is around 100 hectares, then the total size comes out to be around 1600 hectares. Based on this, we developed 3 alternative scenarios for the Parks Plus costing. In the most likely baseline scenario, Parks Plus could cost around $1.7 billion over a period of 10 years. Now, this is considering the average cost of all of the individual projects, which includes all the kinds of restoration project, conservation projects, as well as protection, as well as the protection projects, and the average of all of them. In terms of estimate of the extremes, we also estimated the high cost that could be incurred as part of this project, as well as the low cost scenario. So in terms of the high cost, Parks Plus could cost a total of $3 billion, leaning more towards the more extensive projects, whereas in a low cost scenario, it could cost as low as $600 million, leaning towards relatively less intense projects. Now, the federal government could take up this project based on a sensitivity analysis which could help them determine the feasibility of the baseline project, and how it could be implemented in real life depending on changes in assumptions or considerations. And ultimately, the federal government can take this project up in collaboration with various stakeholders, such as Intact Foundation, such as civil society organizations, civil society organizations, and particularly those engaged in the intersection between natural infrastructure and climate change. Now, in order to compare Parks Plus and justify the cost, we need to compare it to a typical grey infrastructure project. And in this case, urban flood management is a very good example, because in this exercise we can address urban flood management either through grey infrastructure upgrades such as drains and other systems, or through Parks Plus with its wetland and natural infrastructure systems. We also assumed a certain scenario for this thing to estimate and compare this thing tangibly. For a population of around 500,000, a typical grey infrastructure upgrade project would cost somewhere in the range of $700 million, whereas Parks Plus would cost $400 million. Now, both of these cases have a very strong base for helping in climate adaptation. They can reduce public risks. They can enhance the security of infrastructure services and certain common things. But the advantage of Parks Plus is that in addition to these things, it also provides co-benefits, For example, Parks Plus provides areas for recreation. Parks Plus provides areas for strengthening socio-cultural interaction. It provides a method to ensure water security. Beyond that, by integrating carbon sinks such as vegetation and wetlands, Parks Plus also serves as a potential for climate mitigation. So essentially, by combining this entire three of climate mitigation, climate adaptation, as well as co-benefits, Parks Plus presents a much more robust climate action initiative that can enhance community resilience. Now, despite this, typically municipalities go with grey infrastructure projects, since grey infrastructure projects are much more easier and simpler to handle, and because of their departmental silos. For example,
Excuse me, Janmajay,
yeah.
just wrap this up, please, pretty quickly.
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
So basically, with municipalities, they tend to do this because of the departmental silos that are already existing. For example, a typical drainage system is managed by the Public Works Department, and that's why they approach it from an engineering perspective, whereas a park is typically managed by a parks department, which approaches it from an aesthetics and recreation purpose, not necessarily the ecological service mechanism. So Parks Plus as a governance mechanism intends to challenge these silos, and it could also become one of the flagship natural infrastructure projects to tackle climate action and help Canada achieve its goal as per the 2030 Paris Agreement. Ultimately, Parks Plus can become the flagship child of Canada while achieving climate action benefits and incorporating all the long-term sustainability and resilience measures into the community. Thank you. Open for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. To start off with the jurors, Brenda, would you like to kick us off?
Sure would. Thank you so much. I love the idea of urban parks. So I'm sold before you even give the presentation and all of the data. But I do have a question, and that is and it's around the insurance industry that you've kind of built into your proposal. And I understand that you're working with Intact, so there's a certain realism there. But I'm probably not alone, or there will be others who think, while we understand the insurance industry is seized with the issues at a global level of flooding and inundation and forest fires, etc., it's a little harder to wrap our minds, I think, around the role of the insurance industry in an urban park and a municipal setting. And so your presentation doesn't really, to me, in any event, kind of speak to the value of the insurance industry being part of this collaborative. It's already a whole lot of players, and it runs the risk of collapsing under its own scope. So could you explain a little bit the value that you see the insurance partners at the collaborative tables?
So for this question, I'll take part of it, and then I'll ask my colleague Ankita, who talked about a little bit about the different roles and partners, to answer the rest. So how we envision the insurance sector in this in this program, Parks Plus, is in the area of providing especially technical expertise, especially because they are an expert in risk management and risk assessment and risk transfer. In fact, they a lot of data that comes when I just mentioned earlier that floods are one of the costless disasters in Canada, that is a figure that we reference through insured damages, and that's just insured damages. So the picture is much larger than the insurance sector, and that's partly why they phrase the question to ask us how should they engage the federal government to make this a more collaborative, larger scale action across the country. So there is a role for them to play in terms of understanding the landscape of what needs to be done, how these park sites could be assessed, and other pieces of collaboration with, for example, other insurance actors as well. I'll leave the rest of the question to my colleague Ankita, who has more of a focus on the different partners.
So I believe, thank you for the question. First of all, it's a great one. It's something we've been exploring for the past 6 months, and what we have discovered, as Prod said, is that the climate risk that we're facing today encompasses every single industry, every single sector, every single player that can possibly be envisioned, along with all citizens, which essentially means that addressing a complex problem such as this will require the involvement of all players concerned who can in any way potentially be able to contribute. And in the case of the insurance sector, not just Intact, but the entire insurance sector, all the insurance companies that work specifically on climate risks and risk related products, what we've discovered is that they have access to updated contemporary data related to asset evaluation, risk management, and so on, that could essentially be a key component in determining the value of natural assets, the components related to evaluating and managing natural assets in relation to climate risks. So we believe that Intact and in general the insurance sector overall cannot be left out of a discussion of this nature in addressing a complex problem of this nature. That brings us to the end of our response to your question.
Thank you. I'm going to build a little bit on one of the premises of my fellow jurist's question. I wonder if you'd just like to comment about the number of players and kind of the risk and reward associated with it. There seems to be a significant financial burden most likely placed on federal organizations, and the benefits, I guess broadly put, experienced by municipalities and provinces. So one, as mentioned already, it's a very large umbrella covering a lot of organizations. But if I were sitting in the seat of the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure Canada, I'd be saying, why me? So I just wonder if you can just speak to that in terms of the federal government's role and the reasons why they would assume that much financial responsibility.
So I'll firstly address the funding side of it. So basically, Infrastructure Canada already has a certain amount of funds available with them, which they are already investing in these programs. For example, they have the Natural Infrastructure Fund, they have the Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Fund. All of these funds are already providing money to certain projects on a piecemeal basis. What we are suggesting is converting or directing a bit of that amount of money towards these projects as at least a major part of the investment, which can then be matched by the municipalities or through private sector which are benefiting from this, for example, through their CSR activities or through their ESG requirements. And the government also sells green bonds certainly specifically for these kinds of projects, so they can raise money through that too. So this is kind of addressing the bit on addressing the funding requirements that the federal government has. And we believe that these projects can also give large a return on the investment of the federal government, because it has certain commitments to meet in terms with the Paris Agreement that it has ratified to. So I think this project ultimately contributes to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the other piece of that is that by having Infrastructure Canada take the lead, it signals its importance to the public and its scope. So at this point in time, it's been Parks Canada that has been taking a lead on urban parks strategies and advancing reconciliation through urban parks. So we feel that by building up a complementary program with the lead from Infrastructure Canada can also signal that this is really important, and we have there's no more time to not act on climate.
Okay, Shaq.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. So with the emphasis on the federal government paying a lion's share of this, I'm just curious, through your consultations with stakeholders, through your literature review, what is the difference between this program and, for example, the billions they spend on natural climate solutions, the billions they're spending to protect wetlands, indigenous conservation? How is this much different? And if I'm the federal government, why would I say divert money from these programs, if you will, to do Parks Plus?
I think you would take that.
Yeah, so essentially Parks Plus is kind of a combination of all these programs. What federal government is doing is it's basically picking out programs with similar objectives across different scales. For example, the Climate Adaptation Fund has a component of natural infrastructure. The Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Fund also has a component of natural infrastructure. What we are essentially saying is that if all of these similar kind of projects have a mandate to touch upon natural infrastructure, there could be a common program like Parks Plus, which demonstrate a potential governance mechanism as well as a funding mechanisms, where these funds can be channelized through a streamlined method, and that could also help, for example, get private and other provincial governments interested in the funding and how the benefit kind of is captured by them. So this project is kind of a demonstration project which it focuses on co-governance and convergence of these piecemeal and distributed and decentralized schemes. Yeah, that's kind.
And just to add, I mean, I think for all of our policy challenges, we're going to run into the issue of federalism. But what we heard from our interviewees is that there is a lot of challenges in working at the multiple levels of, governance and other civil society and other partners. So to bring everyone to the table through co-governance, that we're trying to see it like both ways, with the steering committee that helps manage things, administratively, but then have each of these boards set up that then they know what the local conditions and contexts are like, to then decide upon, those more specific goals and metrics and evaluation and whatnot. So
In a policy school, don't we think of federalism as an opportunity rather than as a challenge? Okay, as I understand it, Natalie, we do not have the sponsor online. Justin, okay. Question from Justin Leroux online. Coming at us
Hello,
from
everyone.
France.
Yes, I'm saying hi from France. So congratulations. Hi, team. Congratulations on your presentation. I would like to piggyback on the very first question that was asked about the role of Intact. There are, if you were to ask Intact to act tomorrow, which is essentially what your recommendations are, what would be the first steps in the short run to get things going? I think the very first question was, what is the role of this industry, of this insurance industry? How can Intact be a leader of that initiative? And I would like to hear you all on that.
Okay, I'll take this one. So for Intact wakes up in the morning, the first thing they're gonna do, so they're gonna have a cup of coffee, and then they're going to start engaging with the federal government to gauge interest and get buy-in on this program, because these actors need to be assembled. There needs to be Intact needs to show that there is interest on their part to really advance these nature-based solutions and programs like Parks Plus. At the same time, it also should get on the phone with other insurance actors and other private sector actors to essentially come to the table with them, so that it's not just them alone. I think this sends a clear signal, not just from the private sector, that this is an issue that can no longer wait, given that more and more, for example, like homes are becoming uninsurable because of these climate risks really mounting. And for them to really show that this is important to the survival of their sector, which, if it fails, then who are the risks failing to? It falls into households, it falls into the government to essentially pay for the losses to life and livelihoods. So what we need here is really people coming together to get this process going, and that starts with engaging with the federal government to gauge interest and try to find the different partners and different champions within different departments, because this is an ambitious project, and we need no less than ambitious projects to be able to reach these climate goals. And then really to bring a united voice in the insurance sector and in other interested private actors, for example, through IBC or other tables that they sit at, which also will include federal partners as well as other levels of government as well. So that would be the first step.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you very
you.
much.
Justin, you have a follow-up, or?
No, I was just thanking the speakers and Prod in this instance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to open it up to questions from the floor. I want you to know that Aftab in the previous session suggested that I was not permitted to ask a question. I want you to all know here that he is wrong, okay? So not only am I permitted to ask a question, but so is Daniel or Andrew or Leslie or any of you, including the jurors. So I did not see the first hand that went up, but I've got Sandrine and Asma and Neil. Hold on. Okay, so Sandrine, kick it away. Neil.
Can I go ahead, Chris?
Yeah, sorry.
I can?
Yes.
Okay. Congrats on the team for this very, very interesting presentation, and thank you. I have a quick question. You focused a lot, well, most of your recommendations on urban parks, which I think is super interesting, and coming from Montreal, I am pro. I would be interested in knowing why, though, you didn't choose to work on non-urban parks or rural parks, or, yeah.
Okay. So there are multiple answers to that question. One of which is, the first one is one thing that I've already mentioned, is that almost 3 in 4 Canadians live in urban areas. And so the, climate impacts are really impacting a majority of Canadians. So there's a degree, like an element of scale there as well. And that element of scale comes with the fact that really, natural infrastructure, when we talk to stakeholders, we are learning that it is an emerging field. And when we talk to people about climate adaptation, people think about dams and dikes and seawalls, which, are shown to be, for one, in disarray and in need of maintenance and becoming more and more costly. So this area of natural infrastructure is really coming up, but it's not gaining a lot of traction because, one, it's new, and what Jamajay mentioned earlier is that people are working in silos. It's not really traditionally fitting in anything. So there's a real need for capacity building. And so why we want to put it in an urban area is that, one, it's highly visible. It can be partnered with post-secondary institutions to build future capacity, to train future engineers, future policymakers, future environmental scientists, and to work together and to really upskill on this in the field of natural infrastructure solutions. So Parks Plus would be a solution to bring together those pieces. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it is that, we just got to scope into something. The third one, because this is such a large question. And the third part is that rural parks, which we could say are national parks in a way, they have a different strategy for that already, and it looks quite different from what urban parks would look like. Co-governance will also look different in a rural area as opposed to an urban area. And sometimes the trickiest things we're trying to get at the trickiest thing here, which is co-governance in urban areas where, there's land use challenges, there's, stuff is already there. So like, how do we make change happen and where it's really needed? Yeah.
Okay, Asma is next and Neil is on deck.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. I learned a lot. So my question is regarding Indigenous reconciliation. So if I could have a little more detail about how your project will advance Indigenous reconciliation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Asma, for the question. It actually goes back to the question that Justin posed to us in terms of what can Intact do to accelerate this conversation with the federal government tomorrow. Our recommendation in terms of incorporating Indigenous communities, first of all, comes back to the colonial context of their lands being taken away from them. And with that in mind, we recommend that Act 92 of the Canada UNDRIP Act be implemented immediately, which is in relation to the call on all corporate organizations to become a solid, concrete partner in Indigenous reconciliation efforts. Thank you.
Veronique is on deck.
Thanks for a great presentation. Really nicely crystallized too, so it's easy to get one's head around it. I want to pick up on the federal role because I think this would represent a continued kind of aggressive leadership role for the Government of Canada in urban planning, which is not without controversy. And these things tend to work best if some provinces are or are seen to be asking for it. So my question is what would your federal provincial strategy be for Intact to help lay the groundwork for this to be successful?
Could you repeat it once more? So, it's running away. Oh.
Yeah. So the question really is about your federal provincial strategy, because I think with an aggressive federal leadership role, it is worth thinking through how to seed positive success by working with provinces. So for Intact to approach this, what would you recommend be their federal provincial strategy?
We did mention the various governance pieces, so the board membership. I think for us, we did focus more on, groups like AMO or FCM, but that is, again, more towards federal and municipal, given that these perks would be set up at a municipal basis. But you're correct to say that the provinces and territories need to be more involved in just having a seat at a table. I'm going to pause here in case there's others that can add to it.
Thank you, Neil, for the question. It's a very relevant one, especially considering one of the case studies that we mentioned, especially in terms of the co-management, co-governance model. What we drew attention to is the work that an agency like Conservation Ontario is already doing in the province of Ontario in relation to natural infrastructure projects to address climate risks. What we propose and what we recommend is that same model be applied to all other provinces, that other provinces also take that as an example in terms of natural infrastructure restoration projects that can address climate risks. I think Ontario province in that sense is our main case study and our main inspiration for the role that provincial governments especially can play in partnership with municipalities. Thank you.
Okay, Veronique, and Andrew is on deck, but Andrew has left his seat, which means Daniel Weinstock is on deck.
Thank you. Great presentation. Urban settings are usually very crowded. There isn't much space, and you're proposing that 100 to 200 hectares be part of your Park Plus. For me, I'm from Quebec, so that equals to Les Plaines d'Abraham in terms of spaces. So I'm wondering if you could maybe clarify if your Parks Plus is to introduce new parks, in which my question would be where, and if your proposal is to look at existing parks and maybe change the use, my question would be how. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd be answering it in two pieces. First of all, we are aiming to look at certain parks which are already existing but might have deteriorated over time due to maybe encroachment from human activities or due to any other specific impact that has affected that particular area. So, for example, in terms of size, I mentioned like 100 hectares is closer to what La Fontaine is, and 200 hectares is something to what like Mont Royal and High Park, they are already existing. So, we are kind of focusing on existing parks and trying to enhance their kind of ecological performance. Now, this can be done through like the example we picked. It could be done either through extensive restoration or conservation or protection, depending on the intensity required. But the outcomes of all these three activities might be same. The difference in the type of project depends on how badly the park has been maintained over time. And what we intend to do is, over the next few years, we want the parks to be maintained in terms of the ecological performance rather than just their aesthetics or recreation. So it's focused on existing parks, but to enhance their performance in the overall watershed level. Yeah.
Okay, Dan Weinstock, and then I think I might ask a question, just to prove to AFTAB that I can. Andrew has said he's given it up, but if you'd like to ask a question after Daniel, you're on. Daniel.
So, very intriguing presentation. My worry has to do with accessibility. So, if you look at the parks that you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation, I mean, two that I'm familiar with, which are more local, Mount Royal and Central Park, a problem that occurs is that actually they end up becoming a resource that is disproportionately used by very fortunate people, right? Real estate values around them tend to go up. And so the people who can just sort of stroll into Central Park or Mount Royal are people from Westmount or the Upper West Side, and not people from Staten Island or the East. So wouldn't you get more bang for your buck, at least in terms of certain variables, if rather than going in for one very big park, and the question from before, if you just made sure that neighborhoods were well sort of serviced in terms of green space, so that you sort of democratize the proposal over the entire urban landscape, rather than plopping it all down in a place which might end up presenting sort of accessibility issues in terms of socioeconomic.
That is a very, very important consideration that we really had to have a conversation about as a team as well, because the effects of like green gentrification also is also quite real and can be seen, in many places. So the scale in our recommendation, which you can see in more detail in the final brief, we recommend that there's a minimum threshold in size in terms of like how small can it be. It can't just be a tiny parklet, but we're not necessarily looking for something that is as big as Mount Royal, for example, unless it's about this particular project has been assessed so that it determines that indeed like restoring a park that size is the move. Otherwise, a neighborhood, a Parks Plus site that is going to have a demonstrable impact on a neighborhood scale would be sufficient as well. So in that sense, I would say, yes, it would make sense to have Parks Plus sites be on a neighborhood level. And how it would be assessed, we got into that a little bit more when it comes to the next steps of how these sites would be determined. And we're thinking that because it's meant to be reducing particular climate risks, we have to think about, okay, which climate risks and where. And a lot of like research has shown that in areas that enjoy less park spaces, or sometimes they do have park space, but it's just a lawn with some trees and it's low quality. Those will really be cost effective, and it will yield a lot of results for the effort that we're putting in. So in that sense, like like you said earlier for the previous group, the devil's in the details, and how we assess those park sites will matter, and where that will happen would be on the level of the Parks Plus local boards, which will hopefully get together at a later stage in this process to determine what are the sites that should be prioritized and what would be the strategies to mitigate the effect potentially if property values goes up. We don't want to be displacing local residents in the area. What can be put in place to make sure that the people in that area are enjoying the effects of health and of connection, community resilience, or for the implementation of Parks Plus.
Okay, Andrew Potter is back on our list.
This is really interesting. This is really interesting. So I want to go back to the topic a few people have raised about the urban versus not urban decision making that went into your project. So quick anecdote. So I just got back from Alberta, and I was sitting in a parking lot after a hike, talking to a couple that had just finished the hike as well, and they were from upstate New York, and they said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Montreal." And I got beaked at for about 10 minutes about, you gotta put out your fires. Like, why don't you guys put out your fires? I was like, I didn't start the fire. But, there is an issue. When you started this project, at the beginning I thought, natural infrastructure. What is Canada's single biggest piece of natural infrastructure? It's the boreal forest. And while it's a bit unfair of a question I'm pushing towards, because you started this before everything started burning, but this summer, so far 10 million hectares of boreal forests have burned. Your project is ambitious, but it's 1,600 hectares. And I wonder, in retrospect, and not only that, but the way the fires have worked from both an urban life, quality of life perspective, but also an insurance perspective, has proven that urban versus natural divide just doesn't really hold water, right? Like air goes everywhere. So I guess the question would be simply, have the fires events of the last 2 months given you guys any wonder about whether you would have rethought this if you had known in advance that something like that would happen, or do you still think that the project itself Not that it holds water, but would it have given you any cause to rethink the direction?
So I'm from BC, and the wildfires have been burning in BC for a number of years as well. So personally at least, I think I would still propose Parks Plus. And because I also think it's not an either-or question, in that like we should still be trying to stop the fires up there while doing this thing as well. Because here in cities, we still have to deal with climate adaptation. We're still going to be investing, or at least we should be investing in climate adaptation as well, as for floods, for stormwater surges, for whatever, all the things are burning to the ground here. And so yes, and we should be doing those things as well. So I think that no, the wildfires haven't changed. The fact that the smoke is here doesn't change anything. And in fact, if we don't change the way people in cities relate to nature, which is somewhere out there, and we have to make that more relevant in some ways, and change the way we think about nature and make that more accessible for people who do live here as well. And I think that way we stand along a better chance of achieving those goals in the long run, and providing those opportunities for capacity building, which would otherwise not happen.
Thank you very much. I think these first two presentations make it clear that climate adaptation is a complex beast, right? You can devote resources to preventing, not just stopping, but preventing forest fires, or to preventing flooding, or to, restoring wetlands, or, all kinds of things. In some sense, mitigation for climate is conceptually much easier. Climate adaptation is very tough. Thank you very much for a great presentation. It is 11:32, and we have just under 90 minutes for a lunch break. So get back in this room just shortly before 1 p.m., and we'll be ready to go on number 3 on economic development.